What if the most famous event in Christian history looked nothing like the paintings in your church? Forget the glowing, ethereal resurrection scenes from movies. Forget the soft-lit angels and pristine white robes. The real story began in darkness and panic, in the stench of death and the scratch of limestone dust, in a garden tomb outside Jerusalem's walls where Roman soldiers stood guard over a massive stone seal. Picture instead a brutalized body, the grinding sound of stone against stone in the pre-dawn silence. Women approaching with oil-stained hands and hearts full of dread, expecting to find exactly what they'd left there, a corpse wrapped in blood-soaked linen. What they found instead would shatter every assumption about death, power, and the limits of human experience. But to understand their shock, we need to step into their sandals. Feel the weight of that rolling stone. Smell the myrrh and aloes hastily applied between strips of burial cloth. See the clay seals pressed with Roman authority that no one dared break. Because the resurrection of Jesus didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in history, in a specific place, to specific people, under specific circumstances that made it not just miraculous, but impossible. The sun was setting over Jerusalem, and Joseph of Arimathea was running out of time. Hours earlier, he had done something that could have cost him everything. He walked into Pontius Pilate's residence and asked for the body of a crucified criminal. Not just any criminal, the rabbi whose followers claimed he was the Messiah, the one the Sanhedrin had condemned for blasphemy. This wasn't how crucifixion normally worked. Roman practice was to leave bodies hanging for days, sometimes weeks, as a public warning. Let the crows and dogs finish what the nails had started. Let everyone see what happened to those who challenged Rome. But Joseph had status, wealth, political connections, and Pilate, perhaps eager to close this messy chapter, granted the request. Now came the real problem. The Passover Sabbath would begin at sundown, in maybe 3 hours. Jewish law was absolute. No body could remain unburied overnight, especially before the holiest day of the year. No work of any kind could be done once those first 3 stars appeared in the darkening sky. Joseph wasn't working alone. Nicodemus had arrived with 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes, enough spices for a king's burial, worth more than most families saw in a lifetime. Together they supervised the removal of the body from the cross. This wasn't the peaceful death scene from stained glass windows. 3 iron spikes had to be pried from wood and bone. The body they lowered was broken, bloodied, barely recognizable. The scourging alone, 39 lashes with a multi-tailed whip embedded with bone and metal, had flayed the back to ribbons. They had no time for proper preparation, no time for the careful washing, the slow application of preserving ointments, the dignified wrapping that honored the dead. This was emergency burial. The most basic requirements of Jewish law met under desperate circumstances: water to wash away the worst of the blood, strips of linen to wrap the body, the expensive spices pressed between the cloth layers, not to preserve the flesh like Egyptian mummification, but to mask the smell of decay that would begin within hours in Jerusalem's heat. The women who had followed Jesus watched from a distance, noting every detail. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome. They saw the hasty work, the corners cut, the unfinished job. They would remember exactly where the body was placed. They would return Sunday morning with oils and ointments to complete what grief and sunset had left undone. The tomb itself told a story of wealth and careful engineering. Joseph's burial place wasn't a natural cave. It was carved directly from the limestone bedrock in a garden outside Jerusalem's walls, exactly where Jewish law required the dead to rest, away from the living city. The soft stone had been quarried away by skilled craftsmen, creating chambers and shelves with the precision of architecture. This was luxury. The poor were buried in simple trench graves or common burial grounds. Only the wealthy could afford to have tombs hewn from living rock. But the most remarkable feature wasn't inside the tomb. It was the stone. Every artistic depiction gets this wrong. The stone wasn't a boulder that somehow rolled away from the entrance. It was a massive disc, thick, circular, shaped like a millstone. It sat in a specially carved channel that sloped downward toward the tomb opening. Physics made it elegant. Roll the stone down the inclined track, and gravity would seat it perfectly against the entrance. The weight, easily a ton of limestone, would settle into place with finality. But rolling it back up that slope, that required multiple strong men working together. The grinding sound of stone against stone would echo through the garden, announcing to anyone within hundreds of yards that a tomb was being opened. This is why the women's question made perfect sense. Who will roll away the stone for us? It wasn't doubt about their mission. It was practical logistics. They physically could not move that barrier alone. Inside, the tomb followed the pattern archaeologists find throughout first-century Judea, a small antechamber where mourners could gather. Then the burial chamber itself, with stone shelves, called arcosolia, carved into the walls like benches. Jesus' body hadn't been placed on the floor. It lay on one of these stone platforms, wrapped in the linen strips surrounded by the aromatic spices. The headcloth, the sudarion, would have been wrapped separately around the skull and jaw, a practical necessity to keep the mouth closed in death. When the hasty burial was complete, that massive stone had rolled down into position with a sound like thunder, sealed, secure, final. Or so it seemed. The burial was incomplete. In any other circumstance, what Joseph and Nicodemus had done would barely qualify as proper preparation of the dead. The rushed washing had removed the worst of the crucifixion's carnage, but traces of blood still clung to the hair, under the fingernails, in the wounds themselves. The linen strips held the limbs in position and contained the expensive spices. But this was emergency wrapping, functional, not ceremonial. The women who watched understood exactly what they were witnessing: an unfinished job, a necessary compromise with time and law that left the most important work undone. Jewish burial customs required more than this hasty preparation could provide. The body needed thorough washing with warm water and soap, proper anointing with oils and perfumes, the careful, respectful handling that honored both the deceased and the mourner's love. This is why Mary Magdalene and her companions planned to return Sunday morning, not to visit a completed tomb, but to finish what the approaching Sabbath had interrupted. They would bring additional oils, olive oil mixed with aromatic herbs and spices, clay vessels filled with myrrh dissolved in liquid form that could penetrate the skin, soft cloths for washing. Everything needed to transform the hasty emergency burial into something worthy of their teacher. The timing made sense within Jewish practice. The Sabbath prohibited work, but once 3 stars appeared Sunday evening, the restrictions lifted. Dawn would give them light to work by and privacy in the garden setting. Early morning visits to tombs were common. The cool air made the work more bearable, and it allowed mourners to complete their duties before the day's heat intensified the smell of decay. They had memorized every detail Friday evening: which stone shelf held the body, how the head was positioned, where Joseph had placed the wrapped limbs. They would need to unwrap portions of the linen to properly cleanse the wounds, then rewrap everything with their additional oils and perfumes integrated into the cloth. This wasn't morbid fascination. It was love expressed through duty. The same impulse that drives families today to ensure flowers are placed correctly, that headstones read properly, that final arrangements honor the person who died. For the women, Sunday morning represented their last opportunity to care for Jesus' physical body, to offer the gentle attention that crucifixion had denied him, to transform a brutal execution's aftermath into something approaching dignity. They had no expectation of miracle, no thought of resurrection. They were planning to touch dead flesh, to work with their hands in the presence of decay, because love demanded nothing less than completion of what haste had left unfinished. The request came Saturday morning, after the Sabbath restrictions had settled over Jerusalem like a heavy blanket. The chief priests and Pharisees approached Pilate with a problem that couldn't wait until Sunday. They had remembered something, a claim Jesus had made about rising from the dead after 3 days. The fear wasn't supernatural intervention, it was fraud. Command that the tomb be made secure until the 3rd day, they told the Roman governor, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people he has risen from the dead. Pilate's response was characteristically blunt. You have a guard. Go, make it as secure as you can. What followed was a collision between Jewish religious authority and Roman military precision. The tomb that had been sealed by grief and haste on Friday evening was now about to become a fortress. The guard detail would have been small but formidable, likely 4 to 16 auxiliary soldiers, local men serving in Roman ranks. These weren't elite legionaries, but they carried Roman discipline in their bones. The penalty for sleeping on watch or abandoning post was death. Their presence transformed the garden tomb from a place of mourning into a zone of military control. But the real security lay in the seal itself. This wasn't a small wax stamp on parchment. Roman and Jewish sealing of tombs involved heavy cord, thick rope that stretched across the stone entrance and attached to the rock face on both sides. Where the cord crossed the stone and touched the tomb wall, it was pressed into clay that had been softened with water. While the clay was still malleable, official seals were pressed deep into the material. These might bear Pilate's imperial authority or the temple's religious jurisdiction, or both. The clay would harden in Jerusalem's dry air, creating an unmistakable barrier that announced governmental authority to anyone approaching the tomb. Breaking this seal meant more than disturbing a grave. It was direct defiance of the power that created it. If the seal bore Roman authority, breaking it challenged the empire itself. If it carried temple authorization, it violated the religious law that governed Jewish life. The physical act of breaking such a seal required deliberate destruction. The hardened clay had to be shattered, the cord had to be cut or untied. There was no accidental way to breach this barrier, no explanation that could dismiss it as oversight or misunderstanding. For 3 days, this system held the tomb closed. Roman soldiers maintained their watch, the clay seals dried hard as stone. The massive disc remained settled in its groove, held in place by gravity and law and the authority of empire. Until Sunday morning, when everything changed. Dawn broke over Jerusalem with the grinding sound of stone against stone. The women walking through the garden heard it first, a deep, rumbling echo that seemed to shake the ground beneath their feet, the sound of something impossibly heavy being moved uphill against gravity, against logic. When they reached the tomb, the massive disc stone sat displaced from its groove, rolled away from the entrance. They had watched sealed 3 days before, not cracked open slightly, creating a gap they might squeeze through, completely removed. The full entrance to the tomb stood open, dark against the limestone. This changed everything about their carefully planned mourning. They had brought oils and ointments expecting to work carefully. Around the stone's weight, they had discussed who might help them, perhaps finding gardeners or other early visitors to the cemetery who could assist with the rolling. They had prepared themselves for the physical effort of opening the tomb. Instead, they faced a mystery that made no sense within their understanding of death, burial, and Roman authority. The stone that required several strong men to move uphill had been displaced without their knowledge, without their presence, without any explanation they could grasp. The evidence lay not just in the stone's position, but in the manner of its movement. Rolling it away from the tomb required coordinated effort and significant noise. The grinding of limestone against limestone, the scraping of the disc through its carved channel, would have echoed through the garden like thunder. Yet no one in the area reported hearing anything during the night. More troubling was what the displaced stone revealed about timing. The women had arrived at the earliest possible moment Sunday morning, as soon as there was light enough to work by. If human hands had moved the stone, it had happened in complete darkness, before dawn. While Roman soldiers maintained their watch, the physics alone should have made this impossible. Even if grave robbers had somehow overpowered the guard, risking execution for assaulting Roman soldiers, moving the stone required preparation, tools, multiple people working in coordination. It couldn't be done quietly or quickly. Yet here was the evidence. A tomb that had been sealed by imperial authority now stood open in the morning light. The massive stone that had guaranteed security for 3 days had been moved aside as if it weighed nothing. The women approached the entrance with growing dread. Every assumption about what they would find inside, the wrapped body, the work they had come to complete, the familiar positioning of their teacher's remains, was now in question. What they discovered in the tomb's dark interior would shatter their understanding not just of death, but of the fundamental rules governing physical reality itself. Inside the tomb lay evidence that made no sense. The stone shelf where Jesus' body had been placed stood empty, but scattered across its surface were the linen strips that had wrapped the corpse, not torn away or hastily discarded, but lying collapsed as if the body had simply vanished from within them. The women stared at burial cloths that still held their basic shape, the strips that had bound the torso. The arms, the legs, lay in loose folds exactly where they had encircled flesh and bone 3 days before. The expensive spices, 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes, remained pressed between the linen layers, their weight causing the fabric to settle into the stone. But the detail that stopped them cold was the headcloth. The sudarian that had been wrapped around Jesus' skull sat apart from the other cloths, folded neatly by itself, not thrown aside, not unwound and dropped, folded with deliberate care and placed separately from the body wrappings. This made no sense from any practical perspective they could imagine. Grave robbers would have taken the body wrapped as it was. The linen itself had value, and unwrapping a 3-day-old corpse in darkness would be both difficult and revolting. Why would thieves take time to carefully remove wrappings they could sell, then fold the headcloth? If Jesus' disciples had somehow overpowered Roman guards and broken imperial seals, they would have grabbed their teacher's body and fled. The last thing they would do is pause for careful unwrapping and neat folding while Roman reinforcements might arrive at any moment. The evidence suggested something else entirely, something that violated their understanding of death itself. Bodies didn't leave their wrappings behind. Corpses didn't fold their own headcloths. The dead didn't unwrap themselves and arrange their burial clothes with deliberate precision. Yet here was the physical proof that exactly this impossibility had occurred. The tomb held every piece of evidence that Jesus of Nazareth had been buried there, except the body itself. Mary Magdalene backed away from the stone shelf, her mind refusing to process what her eyes recorded. 3 days ago, she had watched Joseph and Nicodemus place a broken, lifeless body on this exact spot. She had seen the linen wrapped around still flesh, had watched the headcloth positioned to hold the jaw closed in death. Now she faced burial clothes that lay empty but undisturbed, folded grave wrappings that suggested not theft or desecration, but something far more impossible to accept. Mary Magdalene ran from the tomb with terror, not triumph, driving her steps. Her first words to the disciples weren't proclamations of resurrection. They were accusations of grave robbery. "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." In her world, in that moment, an empty tomb meant only one thing. Someone had stolen the body. This wasn't faithlessness. It was the most logical conclusion available to a first-century Jewish woman who had lived her entire life understanding that the dead stayed dead. Bodies didn't vanish from sealed tombs guarded by Roman soldiers. Corpses didn't leave their burial wrappings neatly folded behind. Her immediate assumption reflected the grim realities of ancient burial practices. Grave robbery was common enough to drive the wealthy to elaborate security measures, heavy stones, sealed entrances, even guards for valuable burials. Thieves sought expensive shrouds, jewelry buried with the dead, anything that could be sold in Jerusalem's markets. The disciples' reaction mirrored her panic. When Peter and John ran to investigate, they weren't racing toward hoped-for miracle, but toward feared desecration. Their teacher's body had been brutalized by crucifixion, hastily buried, and now apparently stolen. The final indignity in a series of catastrophic losses. Even confronted with the impossible evidence inside the tomb, the collapsed grave clothes, the folded headcloth, the complete absence of any body, their first instinct wasn't celebration, but confusion. John's Gospel records that they did not yet understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Understanding would come later, with further encounters, additional evidence, the slow dawning that death itself had been defeated in this limestone tomb outside Jerusalem. But that Sunday morning began with the most ordinary human response to the extraordinary. Fear, bewilderment, and the desperate attempt to make sense of something that shattered every assumption about reality. The resurrection story starts not with faith, but with 3 women running in terror from an empty grave. By understanding the weight of that stone, the finality of Roman seals, and the raw human terror of that Sunday morning, we glimpse how the most extraordinary event in Christian history began with the most ordinary human emotions: confusion, fear, and loss. The resurrection didn't announce itself with heavenly fanfare. It whispered through folded grave clothes in an empty tomb,